Hello, my name is Andriana Rivera, and I am doing a presentation on the theorist Stanley Milgram for my senior seminar class. To start off with some context, in 1933, the Nazis came to power in Germany. And this is important because this was actually the same year that Milgram was born. Although geographically, living in New York, he was far away from everything that was happening, his family was still very aware of what was happening in Nazi Germany. They had family over there and were listening to the radio, and the constant concern was very apparent. So Milgram also grew up surrounding a lot of that. It is also significant to note that the relatives who did survive the Nazi concentration camps stayed in Milgram's household during 1946. This allowed him to learn a lot about the behavior of the Nazis and how his family members were treated. Because of being surrounded with this theme constantly from childhood to adulthood, he grew a curiosity for reasons behind behavior and also just a genuine interest in social psychology. After school, Milgram enrolled at New York City Queens College, majoring in political science with a minor in the arts. After that, he was accepted into Harvard's Department of Social Relations graduate program, where his curiosity for social and the way people act also came into encounter with his interest in cross-cultural studies. He studied under well-known psychologists today, such as Gordon Allport, Roger Brown, Solomon Asch, and others. He was very interested in the conformity and group pressure studies by Asch and studied closely under him. He went on to further his work on conformity, but further intensified it by making sure he studied people from different countries. The original experiments by Asch were involving a group of participants that were asked questions with very obviously correct answers. However, the trick was there was only one participant out of 7 that was actually real and not a Confederate. So how he did it is he had a box of lines and he asked the participant to match one line to the other line, and the answer was very obviously one or the other, but every single person before him answered the wrong question. So the goal of the experiment was about group conformity, to see if the participant would answer the same as everybody else or answer the question that he knew the correct answer was. Now, working as a teacher's assistant under Asch, Milgram decided he wanted to continue Asch's experiments. He conducted them in a very similar manner, except instead of pictures, he used sounds and asked the participants which sounds matched the other. However, instead of having other people, he had pre-recorded people saying which sounds they thought matched, so he could then use this in a lot of different other settings and didn't require as many people to the experiment. In doing this, he was able to take it to people in different countries and just make the experiment a lot more mobile. Continuing research in conformity, Milgram stepped away for a minute from group pressure and started studying more obedience, which is where we see his famous Milgram shock experiment. I'm going to be talking a lot about his shock experiment because this is among the basis that he built his obedience theory. So I'm going to talk about his shock experiment and the criticisms of that because it is tied so closely with Milgram's obedience theory. Let's jump right in. Most everyone knows the basis of this experiment if they've taken a Psych 101 class, but the basics are there is a subject and they are the only real participant in this study, and they are being told by an experimenter to administer shock to a participant. This experiment's goals are in a hope to understand how much a person is going to listen to an authority, even if it's harming another person. Here's a bit more of a visual of what's going on. You have the experimenter telling the subject to administer shock to the learner or the Confederate every time they get an answer wrong, and the experimenter will continue to urge the subject to higher the voltage and continuing to shock even though the learner is experiencing they're acting, but continuing to experience and yell in pain. They were aiming to see how long the subject would go administering the shocks until they would no longer listen to the authority figure. The real shock of this experiment was that no subject stopped administering prior to 300 volts. And at 300 volts, the victim kicks the wall and no longer provides answers to the multiple choice questions, which essentially means they are incapacitated and cannot respond. And of the 40 subjects in this experiment, more than half obeyed the orders of the experimenter to the very end of 450 volts, which was a lethal amount of voltage. This experiment was continually performed in a variety of different ways, which led Milgram to his ultimate conclusion of obedience theory. Here's a quote from one of his articles that explain his obedience theory pretty well. So he said, "A substantial portion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority." Short after this theory, experiment, and discussion were released, he did get a lot of critique from fellow researchers. Many people had trouble believing the validity of the accurate deceptions of danger. They just couldn't understand that a person would commit such things full well knowing the danger of what they were doing. So a lot of people assumed that the actors were not very convincing, or also that the people in the experiments kind of picked up on what was going on. Orton Holland cites something called demand characteristics, and these happen when subjects attempt to detect the meaning of the experiment and then give the researchers kind of what they are wanting. So they guess that this might have happened as well. Another big critique came out, and this researcher had two, among many others, main critiques about this, and one was the concern for the welfare of the subjects, and the second one was the adequacy of experimental design. However, Milgram wrote a whole journal for a rebuttal, and he says that after a debrief, 4/5 of subjects felt that experiments of that sort should be carried out more, assuming that they approved of them and didn't think that any harm had come to them because of it. Rebutting against the other point, he responded against the feelings that obedience cannot be meaningfully studied in a laboratory setting, and he said that just because observed obedience does not count because it occurred where is it appropriate does not mean that it will not occur in other places. He says this is precisely why it's not so much about the situation, but about man's motives behind the situation, and he gives some examples for those. Overall, based on these critiques that we've went over, these are the three ones that continue to pop up in other people that critique him. These seem to be the main themes. We also reached the critique on the question of morality. Many people say that comparing this to Nazi Germany is a lot different. One person in general said that this is a stark contrast because Milgram was studying human weakness, while Nazi Germany was more about human willingness to compete evil, which are two different things and cannot be compared to each other, the theorist claimed. Although up until now, Milgram's theories and experiments have been very influential to help us understand human behavior, people in the last 10 years don't seem to like him a whole lot. They seem to be more leaning towards critiques than saying how he helped us understand things. One thing I noticed probably that I can make a connection with is the trend of humanism lately. A lot of people definitely want to believe we have free will and free choices, and they want to know that our morality is not something that can be lost because of our human tendencies. I'm also noticing that even psychologists are saying that there is a lack of philosophical and theoretical discussion in this obedience when creating this theory, which is not something that I would have thought about in just a psychological worldview, but is an interesting thing to note that's coming up in research today. I saw this in a few articles. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and here is my list of references.